Yes, you're good to go.
All right, awesome, very awesome. Thank you very much. So we're going to be talking about automating Microsoft security with Playbooks and Sentinel. It's one of the things I do day out and day out. And I wanted to share some experiences, some tips and tricks. So the goal of this session is really to get you an idea, not just what is Playbooks, what is Sentinel, but also how to start with it and how to get going and also start automating those Microsoft security incidents. We are a really small crowd today, so I would also just suggest let's keep this interactive. If you have any questions, pop them into the chat. I will keep an eye on the chat to make sure that it's all that we can have an interactive session and talk about and have a small discussion as well. So of course, first of all, a big thank you to the sponsors of this event. This is an entirely free event. Everybody is welcome to join with no entry fee, which is always awesome. So big thank you to the sponsors and also to Drago for creating this awesome event, just like previous year. So what are we going to be talking today? We're going to do a small introduction of Sentinel, a small introduction into logic apps, and then we're going to be diving to authentication, a demo. We're going to be demoing several logic apps, but also build a logic app of ourselves and focus on practical tips and tricks. Because in theory, it's always easy to go ahead and do it and implement stuff. But there's some tiny parts which could make a really big difference when you get to know it from the get-go. So who am I? Most of you know me because you're all colleagues. But my name is Stace. I work for the collective, and I have dual role. I am both the lead of our SOC team, and I'm also a security consultant. Besides that, I'm active on Twitter and LinkedIn. I have a blog, and I'm also one of the co-authors of the Microsoft 365 security for the IT Pro book, which is actually having a new release this December. So certainly check that out because there's also a chapter written there by myself on how to work with Microsoft Sentinel. So really quickly, it's important to know that Microsoft is both a SIEM and a SOAR. You have some products which are only a SIEM or only a SOAR, but Microsoft Sentinel is both of them. So as a SIEM, it will collect all of the data, do intelligence, and potentially spit out some incidents. Well, with the SOAR, we'll do incident response, but we can also automate that incident response. And we're going to be talking about that SOAR part because with Playbooks, we'll automate the incident response on certain signals we see within our SIEM. So the day-to-day is really focused on SOAR and using the capabilities of Sentinel to its fullest. Before we dive into Playbooks and automation and logic apps, just a small introduction on where we are. Everything within Sentinel is built on top of log analytics. Log analytics, you probably already know, is just a common resource which is available within Azure. And Sentinel is essentially a solution on top of that. So Sentinel enables features on top of log analytics. But log analytics is the main building block. What do we have else? Well, of course, we need to have data within the SIEM. So we will do data collection through enabling different data connectors, which will get the data from different sources into our SIEM system. And once it's in the SIEM, we can do alert through creation. We can look through the data, we can hunt it, we can visualize it through Playbooks, and we can create incidents. And of course, these incidents can be investigated both through the portal and through API or through other means because it's all extractable. But of course, the main reason why we are here is to talk about the response part, the automated response parts. So through automation and through logic apps to automate some of the manual tasks you should normally do, we will automate through some of the existing Azure components. So to start off with, it's really important to note that all of the automation it's built within Sentinel, it's built on top of Azure Logic Apps. Azure Logic Apps you might not know, but you probably know Power Automate or Flow. And while Power Automate or Flow is more meant for business automation, Azure Logic Apps is, Power Cloud Automator Flow is really meant to do personal automation. So for an end user who receives an email, save the documents into OneDrive, for example, while Azure Logic Apps, it's really meant for business automation, security automation, automating those critical parts. And so within Sentinel, that's what we use primarily. And it also has another name. When you're talking about Azure Logic Apps within Sentinel context, it's called a Playbook. So you will often see Playbooks and Logic Apps, both terms are being used between each other, but they both mean the same. So when I talk about Logic Apps or Playbooks, I mean the same. Now, why would we care or use automation in the first place? Well, there's a few different points, a few different scenarios and use cases I see, which are applicable to every organization. So at first, we have the notification and synchronization, and this is really simple. If an incident is created in Sentinel, it has a certain action, and this could be send an email to the security team, or send a message in Teams, or send a text message, a notification when an incident is created. This can be really simple, but for example, what we build in our own stock is a synchronization between Sentinel and our ticketing tool. And there's a bidirectional sync through multiple Logic Apps, keeping both two data sources in sync with each other. Besides that, we have enrichment, and I think that's probably the biggest part, and it's the quickest win you can have when looking into automation. When you do incident response, there will always be some manual tasks, some tasks which will always be the same in each incident you do. For example, if you get an incident with an IP, you will want to know, okay, what is the reputation of that IP? What is the geolocation of that IP? What is the owner of that IP? So getting all of that information and plugging it in the case, it's something which is done always anyway, so why not automate it? Why not have a Logic App get that information for you and push it out into the incident so you don't have to do it yourself? This is mostly a quick win because it's easy once you get to know the information. What is a little bit harder is automated actions. And this can be two parts. Automated action could be when I see certain incidents, I will isolate the device or block the user, but it can also mean based on certain conditions, we will automatically close the incident. If you know that you have a certain false positive, or you know there's a certain behavior which will create or generate this incident, you can create a playbook as well to do the automation to automatically close it. This is, in my opinion, it's not trickier to do compared to just regular enrichment because it takes a lot of work and you have to keep track of everything. So that's why I always recommend start with enrichment and then move to automated actions later on, because enrichment is where the quickest win is. It will be the biggest time saver you can have. So Logic Apps, it's of course nothing specific to Sentinel. It's just a regular Azure resource which you can use. You can just create if you have access to Azure, but we use it in the context of Sentinel, of course. There's two big parts within Logic Apps. We have triggers and we have actions. A trigger means when is this Logic App run? This could be simple. It's on a timer, or you press a button and it runs, or there is an HTTP call. But this could also be, for example, if an incident is created in Sentinel, I will run a specific Logic App. Besides that, we can have one trigger, then we can have multiple actions. So these actions can be simple actions, but the beauty of Logic Apps is it's all integrated and it's a low-code platform, which means, for example, we can see here there is an action, post a message to the SOC channel. If you would do this outside of Logic Apps, you would need to know the API for Teams, the formatting requirements. It takes a lot of work to get to know a specific API for a specific product. The great thing is that an action, it contains that underlying code that is a creator of that Logic App. You don't have to know that code. You can just reuse the intelligence behind it. And that's the beauty of it. Everything is integrated, and it can be pretty easy to click your way through and create an automation you want. The last point is an FYI, because it's in terms of cost, because when you run Logic Apps, it's not included in your Sentinel consumption and your Sentinel pricing. And there is an additional charge when you're talking about Azure Cost. And there's two plans. One of them is a consumption, and it's what says the name. Each time you run it, you will pay for it. If it doesn't run, you don't pay for it. This is a really easy thing to do because if you're building smaller logic apps and that don't run it often, it will be a really, really small charge because you only pay what you actually use, so what you run. There's also the standard plan, and that standard plan can be compared to Azure Functions, a premium Azure function or a premium app service, where you actually pay for the underlying compute and you will reserve the underlying compute, which means you will pay for that compute even if the logic app doesn't run. This is really meant for two specific use cases, in my opinion. One of them, if you need to get into a Playbooks runtime, it needs to happen really, really quickly, and you can't have delay of like 30 seconds. A standard plan has the ability to spin up more quickly, but also besides that, it can have a higher load. So if you're talking about running logic apps that will run 100 consecutive runs, for example, in a second or in a minute, it might be that you're going into the limits of a consumption logic app and you need to switch to a standard logic app. So this is logic apps really in general, triggers actions compared to Lego, where you could create the Lego blocks to move forward. So the standard question, with standard a fixed fee for infinite runs at high performance, or is there also a counter? Not sure what you mean, Louis. So you don't pay for the runs with standard, you pay for the underlying compute. So it's like buying a VM. You buy a VM with a certain CPU and RAM, and that will be used to run the script. And you can push that VM as hard as you want, as long as you don't overtake the RAM and CPU you have been allocated. Within Sentinel, of course, there is a tight integration with logic apps. So there's also actions included. And by those actions, I mean, again, everything in Sentinel, it's an API, but we don't need to know the API. We can use the built-in actions. So we have a couple of integrations. One of them is we have the triggers. So this means when will an incident automatically run? And that's also the beauty of it. We can have a logic app or playbook run when an alert is created, an incident is created, or an incident is updated. So we have a couple of things we can use. And this is an awesome integration because if you would be building, for example, from a third-party platform, if you would want to have the script run when an incident is created, you would need to pull Sentinel every minute, check has something new happened, and then run the rest of your script. But here, what we do is it's all built in, and the logic app will be automatically triggered, automatically run when the incident is created. So this saves you the work of having a polling engine or building something yourself. It's all built in within the logic apps. Besides the triggers, we of course have actions. On the right-hand side, you can see some examples. We can get the incident, update the incident, interact with watch lists, interact with alerts, interact with entities. We can do a lot of built-in actions, and almost everything which is possible through the API is also possible through an integrated logic app action. So I talked about the triggers. How is this connected? Well, if you're creating a playbook, a logic app with a Sentinel trigger, it doesn't mean it will run automatically. You have to build something in. So if you build a playbook with a Sentinel trigger, it doesn't run automatically, but you can also run it manually. So within the portal, you could say, I now want to run this manually. Of course, we want to automate that. So what we can do is we can create automation rules as seen on the right. And this also has a trigger. And this will run, for example, when the incident is created, it will have an action. And that action could be run playbook. And then it's all interconnected. You have the playbook with a specific trigger. You have the automation rule, and that automation rule will run. And based on the conditions, trigger the playbook. And that's where you want to be. You want to have as much automated runs as possible. For me, there's two main cases on having a manual approach. One of them is if you're testing the playbook and developing the playbook, you might not be 100% sure of the conditions you want to take or the steps you want to have it tested. So you can manually run the playbook to make sure that you are content on what's it doing, and then decide on doing an automated trigger. Besides that, some of the actions you might not want to do automated, but you want to do through a playbook. Let's take the example of a password reset, for example. Yes, you could go ahead and go through the portal and execute a password reset, but we can build a playbook which will do the password reset, send an email to the user, to the manager, and to IT, for example. And all of those steps can be integrated into one flow. And that's one less thing for the SOC analyst to think about. He does need to worry about sending emails, sending those notifications that a password reset happened. It's all done through the playbook. So it doesn't mean that because there is an automated way to trigger playbooks, that it's always the right way. There are use cases for manually triggering a playbook. We have three different triggers. We have alerts created, incident created, and incident updated. Previously, before, I think it's like 2 years ago, we only had alert triggers. We didn't have incident triggers. So back in the time, it was all alert based. Now I see most people defaulting to incident triggers. And I would recommend that incident triggers is the way to go, because most of the things you will do based on the incidents. For example, if you do synchronization or notification of the incident, well, use an incident trigger, of course. Don't use an alert trigger because you want to have notifications for incidents, not alerts. Also, if you're talking about automatically closing an incident, but you cannot close an alert. So automated closure will always happen based on an incident, not an alert. And also, when we're talking about alerts coming from the Microsoft 365 Defender connector, so all the alerts created in security.microsoft.com, they don't support an alert trigger. They will only support an incident trigger. And that's an important distinction to make. So all of the alerts are supported for the alert trigger, except the alerts coming from security.microsoft.com. While talking about this, you might think, okay, what is even the use case for having that alert trigger? Does it still make sense? To me, it makes perfect sense to do alerts, and mostly when you're talking about enrichment. So this is a small diagram which I like to use, is where we have the alert. This could be, let's say, a typical travel. And a typical travel alert on itself, it might not need to be investigated just because it has a really, really low true positive rates. But we can also automatically do enrichment based on the alert, and based on the enriched data, create an incident. So a great example could be if a typical travel happens, it will do enrichment. It will look into the reputation of that IP. And if the reputation of that IP is deemed malicious, it will create the incident. So this means you will only create incidents when it's necessary. And that's a beautiful thing, in my opinion, because you want to try to avoid to create an incident. An incident is something which needs to be investigated by a SOC analyst. So if you can try to avoid the incident creation as much as possible, that's where you want to be at. So for me, automated actions and synchronization, that's through incident triggers. If we're talking about enrichment, I do like to use alert triggers. Of course, as said before, the only exception is with alerts coming from Microsoft 365 Defender, because that does not support an alert trigger. That only supports an incident trigger. So that's it for triggers. Now we come into the actions. And when we're talking about actions, it's really important to think about authentication as well. How are we going to be authenticating our actions? And there's three main options where what we can use. One of them is a user account. So this could be a simple service account where we use username and password, and we use that within the Logic app. Second could be a service principal. So this is an app registration you create in your own tenant. You provide the necessary permissions, you get a secret and an app ID, and you use that app ID and client secret within the Logic app. And the last point is a managed entity. And this is something specific to Azure. We can activate a managed entity for a Logic app. And this means that a service principal will be built for that Logic app. And the beautiful thing is that the authentication is handled by the Azure platform. And we don't have to manage app IDs and secrets and have the lifetime of that secret renewed. We don't have to worry about that because that's handled by the Azure platform. So to me, it is a better solution compared to service principals because we don't need to worry about the secrets being used. And for me, it's also the clear winner if we are deciding what authentication methods we should be using, because a user account, that's for me a thing of the past. Service accounts should not be used anymore because they can be really dangerous. They have issues with MFA. You will get into conflicts with other security policies. So the way to go is through apps. And if you can decide, use a managed entity, just because then the Azure will manage the secrets and the authentication for you. So we have authentication out of the way. We need to use managed entities. It's the most advised. It's not applicable in all scenarios. There are some scenarios where I still use a service principal myself. But in most cases, I do recommend to look into managed entities just because a part is handled by Azure, by the Azure backend, and it removes some of the management work, some of the management tasks you would have to do. So moving on, what kind of actions can we do from a Logic app? I talked about that we have Sentinel actions. We can interact with incidents, alerts, and watch lists, but we can do much more as well. So we also have third-party actions, so built-in actions where you also don't need to use the API, which means, for example, going into Defender for Endpoint and isolating a device, or running a live response query, or collecting an investigation package, running an antivirus scan. Those are all built-in actions we can take, but it doesn't stop up until Microsoft. There's also a lot of third-party integrations. So for example, VirusTotal has a built-in integration, and even FortiGate, which means we can essentially block URLs, block IPs on our FortiGates, which will be hosted on premises. So that's a great example. You wouldn't expect FortiGates to be integrated within a Logic app per se, but that's the awesome work the Sentinel team has been doing to allow third-party security products to be natively integrated as well. But even if there's no native action, nothing built in by default, we can still use regular HTTP calls. So an HTTP call can just be a regular API integration. And if you have a product which is not integrated by Logic apps by default, we can do everything through API calls, which is also a perfectly viable solution. But the thing is, if you can, of course, use the integrated actions, just because it spares you the work of doing the API calls manually, learning the codes, learning the specifics. So I have been talking for half an hour. Let's just dive into the portal to see how that looks. And we can see some of the things I have discussed. So I will get the Sentinel page. So here we have the Sentinel overview. And of course, we have the incidents tab, we have the data collector tab, but we are talking about the automation rules. So at the start, we can see all of the automation rules that we have created. We can easily create a new automation rule like this. Here we provide our name, we provide the trigger, incident or alert. We can add conditions, we can add and or conditions if we want. And then we have the actions, and this could be run a playbook. And then we can select the playbook that we want, like this. Or we can also have other things like changing the status through an automation rule. For playbooks, we also have a Playbook Gallery, which can be extremely useful because then you don't need to create it from scratch. So I always recommend to check the Playbook Gallery to see what is available from Microsoft itself. And imagine if you're looking into synchronizing to Jira, you can have the tag, you can select the tag synchronization, if I'm not mistaken, sync, and you can see every playbook which is going to be using the synchronization of something from Sentinel to another product. So this is a great example of just things which are already there by the Sentinel team and by the community, which you can reuse to build your own automation. Wherein here we can see the playbooks which we have already deployed, and you can see an overview if they're using a Sentinel action, a Sentinel trigger. I have two open right here, just really quick examples to just showcase what is possible. This is a basic logic app which will block the IP on an Exchange server. So not Exchange online, but really Exchange on premises. This is again a great example of how it can integrate not just with the cloud, but also on premise, as we can have a incident trigger, and this will actually run an automation account, and this automation account is connected to on premises. And here we can just run PowerShell scripts to block IPs on on-premises Exchange server. That's an on-prem example. We can also look into a cloud example. This is to do with Azure AD identity protection. So in this case, we can have an alert trigger, which will convert the user as risky. Here, it's a great example. We don't use the built-in actions, but we use the HTTP calls, just because the built-in actions don't support service principal authentication here. So we have decided to use a basic HTTP call. But again, it's not rocket science. Once you know the URI, and you can have the URI from the documentation and the correct authentication, it's really easy to trigger it and have the output ready for you to go. We can easily expand additional steps here. So we can have an action, and we could choose a Microsoft Sentinel comment. So let's choose Microsoft Sentinel. We will search for comments. We will add a comment to that incident. And here we need to find the message we want to post. And the beautiful thing of Logic Apps is we can use the content which was generated from the previous steps. So we could provide the outputs of the accounts, for example, and look into, okay, account name has been confirmed as risky. This is essentially variables. If you're used to programming, it's a relatively simple step to do, to be using the variables, the dynamic content within the playbooks, but it is a great example of how easy it can be to integrate multiple products without that deep of a development background. I talked about dynamic content. What we also have is we have expressions, and this is another part of the portal. And maybe instead of showing the slides, I can just show it in the documentation. So we have the dynamic content right here, but we also have expressions. Now, expressions can get tricky. It's essentially a way to do lightweight coding, but within Logic Apps. Imagine if I have the account name, but I want to update it somewhere in the string. I can look into the functions which are available, and I could say to lowercase. I go back to my dynamic content, and I find the output, which I can copy from here. I paste it in there. I need to adopt this to remove those settings. I click OK, and now it has been done to lowercase. So these expressions can be used to augment some of the default Logic Apps behavior. Besides string functions, it can also do mathematical functions and others as well. But it can be really complicated really fast. As you saw, I had to remove some of the signs or the symbols from what I have copied. And you really need to know what you're doing. And imagine if you're building a really large playbook and you need to do a substring, do a split, do a concat, do lower. it can be really confusing and really hard to have multiple expressions, multiple functions after each other. So what I do recommend is if the expressions are getting too difficult to manage, you can always integrate with a thing, for example, like Azure Functions. And if we search for functions right here, we can, if it wants to load, we can click Azure Functions and we will be able to trigger functions ourselves. So here it would have listed all of the Azure functions that we have in the environment. I don't have any as an example, but this is a great example of how you can also pivot from Logic Apps to other Azure resources. So if you don't have the knowledge or the joy to do it in Logic Apps, you can always switch to functions. And if you know, okay, I have this specific use case, and it's really, really simple to do it within PowerShell or Python or JavaScript, it might make sense to pivot away from the Logic app and do it in an Azure function. Just because an Azure function does support regular code, and you can pivot between the two. So don't fix yourself on using those tricky expressions, but use the other Azure resources as well, because they're all integrated. Another tip I can give you, which is something I learned just by doing it and by bumping into things in the road, it's easy to build one really, really big Logic app, which will, for example, do unfamiliar sign-in. And in the unfamiliar sign-in playbook, I will get the user activity, get the IP activity, check the out of office, check the MFA configuration of that user, and have a playbook that's too big that you need to scroll so much in the screen to view it as a whole. And that's where it can get really confusing, one, to look at it, but also just to then create other playbooks with the same logic. Because if you're going to be building large playbooks, large monolithic playbooks, you will have code reuse, because at two places you will use IP enrichment, for example, and you will have the code in two different places, which is never a good thing. So also know that you can trigger a Logic app from another Logic app. So that's what we actually did with a customer a little while back ago, is we used a modular approach where we had different modules, like the module for IP. And this holds all of the logic to get IP enrichment. It will call multiple thread providers to get the reputation of that IP and send it back to the main playbook. And that main playbook can use that knowledge, that intelligence from that module without having the complexity to rewrite that code again. And that's also great in terms of empowering your SOC analysts to build such simple playbooks, as you can create the modules, which can be really complicated, do lots of different API calls, call functions, whatever you like, but have a SOC analyst use those modules and have a really simple input and output. And then the SOC analysts don't need to know the specifics and the deep dive behavior of a module. They will just plug into the module, see the input, see the output, and use that. So this may be something which doesn't come up at first, because when you're just starting Sentinel automations, you probably won't think about module and a modular approach, but it's something I really recommend once you're starting off and building complex Logic app and having 10 or 20 Logic apps. Having those modules will really help you to speed up processes and speed up development time, and avoid that you're using the same code across different places. There's also actually a great module from Microsoft, and it's called the Sentinel Triage Assistant. And this is the same approach that I have mentioned now, but also built and maintained by a couple of Microsoft engineers. Let me see if I can also get that into the chat so I can share it, because this is also a great example of how such a modular approach could look like. And they have different modules to do KQL, to do out of office, to get user information. And the beautiful thing is you can just plug onto those modules yourself. So you don't need to build or maintain those modules themselves. Microsoft will do it, and you plug into those modules. So Once you have that, and you've started to create complex logic apps, it's time, of course, for testing and validation, because you need to be able to know, what is my playbook going to do? And is it going to do what I want it to do? And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. But because unfortunately, we can say to the logic app, here you have some dummy data, play around with it. Because, for example, your playbook might also query into KQL, query into Sentinel, and get data and use the sign-in logs that you retrieve through KQL in the playbook. But there's no real good way to have a clear testing environment with all of the data you need to start building and validating your playbooks. So what I recommend is that you do a what-if mode, is where you have the playbook running, but you don't update anything. So don't update the status of the incident, don't change the severity, don't close it, but just add comments on what it was supposed to do. And then you can manually trigger the playbooks, see how it behaves. You can see the outputs in the incidents, but you are not affecting production incidents. So you're not closing an incident, for example, which could be by mistake because you have an issue in the playbook, but you can do a manual trigger with the what-if mode to make sure that you can get going at an easy pace. And also how it looks like when you're developing and how the development modes of such a playbook could happen, as you will start with a pseudocode. So you should write out, what do I want to do? Certainly, if you're going to be talking about complex scenarios, you want to write out, I want to get this data from this source. I want to check this condition. And if this condition matches, I want to close the incident, and really have an idea on what you're trying to build. Because if you need to update the playbook afterwards, it will mean you will lose time to rebuild some things. So having a strong foundation and knowing what you want to do is extremely important. And then you can build a module. So build the different modules you need for that one playbook. Looking into the authentication, look into the security. So make sure that you have a good security posture, that the authentication is doing the right way, not only to sources like the Graph API, the Azure API, but also between different logic apps. We need to restrict who can call my logic app, who can retrieve the data, who can get my secrets. So authentication and security is, of course, a big place. Then we can go into testing and validation. Let's test it. Let's see if it works like we intended to, maybe through that what-if mode I mentioned. And then we can go for a production enablement where we put it live. So I will try to have a small demo. I don't have that much time left, but let's see if we can speed run this to also showcase how easy it might be. So I have the scenario where I want to do a really basic check, and it's going to be a stupid check, and I don't recommend you do it in production. But just for the sake of the demo, we have an incident, we have a user attached to the incident, and we want to check, does that user have an out of office? And if the user does have an out of office, we want to close the incident. So of course, this is not something you want to do in production, because it's a too easy check to close an incident, but it will just showcase how you can get external data and use that to influence the logic you have built and the incident you have built. So what I have done is I have created a playbook, a brand new playbook, which is currently empty. And the first thing I need to do is make sure that I can authenticate from my playbook to both the Graph API to get my out of office message, and to Azure to update the incident. So what have I done? I have assigned a system assigned managed entity. So this is now an application within Azure AD by which I can attach permissions. I have prepared a small script. And what will the script do? The script will go out and add the permissions mail settings with read to my playbook, so I can retrieve those out of office messages. So if you give me a sec, I will get my credentials and I will log in. And the script will run, and we can assign those permissions and get going that way. Approve the message. Now let's hope this goes fast. If I run this, this should go Perfectly fine. And you can see that I have assigned Microsoft Graph permissions to the logic app I use, and the permission I'm using is mailbox settings and reads. So now we can go back into the logic app. Now we have just assigned the graph permissions. We still need to assign the Azure permissions. So I will copy the name, going to my Sentinel, go to settings, go to workspace settings, and go to access control. And I will assign permissions to my logic app. So I will choose a Sentinel responder, which will be able to read the incident and close it. I will choose a managed entity, and I will select the managed entity which we just created. So the logic app, this one right here. Okay, we review that we created. So right now the permissions are okay, and we can move into the logic app. I will start in the designer with a blank logic app. So we will select blank logic app. And now we need to decide if we want to create an alert trigger or a incident trigger. Because I want to close the incident, I will use a incident trigger. So I will go into Sentinel and choose incident like this. And we will connect through the managed entity, so through the system assigned managed entity. And as you can see, without having to fill in any credentials, any secrets, any passwords, we can authenticate. So that's the first step. The next step is, of course, we want to do that HTTP call. And I need to look into my notes and see what API call we exactly need, because I have forgotten that one. So I will paste the docs. So right here, these are the Microsoft docs, and we can see we have get user mailbox settings, which also includes automatic replies. So we can see what we need to do is we can use a simple get and use the UPN of the user to get those automatic replies. So I will copy this, go into my logic app, and of course, if we first we need to check, is there a built-in action? But for this specific reason, there's no built-in action, so we need to use an HTTP call. So I go with this, I choose HTTP, I want to do a get method, paste the URI in, so this is HTTP graph microsoft.com/e1.0/. Now, of course, here I have hard-coded UPN, and I need to get that from the instance. If I will search now for user principal name, I will not find it yet because I have not extracted information from the trigger. So what do I need to do? I need to create another step in between, add an action, choose Sentinel, and choose entities get accounts, and this will extract the accounts involved in the incident. So as simple as that, I select it, and now it did not save, of course. Graph.microsoft.com. I can remove this part, and if I search for user principal name, or what is it? It's going to be account name. If I'm right, I choose account name. And you can see it automatically created for each. Why is that? It's because an incident can have multiple accounts. So there could be 2 accounts, 2 users involved into the same incident. And the logic apps knows this and will automatically adapt itself to that. So I click got it. And now we have done that API call. I need to assign the permissions, which use authentication, managed entity, and go to the Graph API, graph.microsoft.com. And then we need to use that data. So what we can do is we can create a condition right here. So we take control, then condition. This is an if statement, really simple. And then we want to use the output of the API call just use. Because as you can see, the logic app doesn't know what kind of output I have. So we need to make the logic app aware, okay, this is the output you would expect. So we need a parse JSON step, and we need to tell the logic app what kind of data might you expect. So we search for parse JSON. And when it wants to load, we will see the action parse JSON right here, like this. the content as the body, and then we need to provide a schema. So what kind of JSON objects will we expect? The most easy thing to do is go back to the documentation for Microsoft, look into the Graph API documentation, copy the output, and select I want to create a schema based on a sample. Click this, copy, press enter. And now if you go back to the condition, we can go and we can see everything which is returned from that API call. Then we can see, okay, there's something called external reply message, and we can go external reply message is not equal to, so it's not equal to null. This means there is a external message, and then we can add an action. So imagine if there is an out of office, what do we want to do in this case? And really easily, we can select the Microsoft action, go into update incident, provide the incident RMID, which is the unique identifier of that incident, like here, and we can change the status to closed. And then we can have a closure reason, a false positive, and closure reason text. User has out of office enabled, and we can even add that out of office text. So with a really simple few steps, we have just gone into getting the playbook to trigger, getting it to run, get the account information, go into Exchange Online, get the out of office, and update that incident. So now we could just run that, and it would add an information into the incident. So this is just one example of how it could look like, but it showcases how easy it is with playbooks, with those built-in actions, to automate some of the incident response capabilities. So before I close off, I want to provide some practical tips and tricks to get you going and to get you started. One important thing I always like to do is use log analytics even in playbooks, because within the playbooks, you will receive and retrieve a ton of information. You will get out of office information, IP information, user activity information. And I really recommend that you save that information to log analytics in a custom table, because that enables you to use it later on in additional hunting rules and additional queries and additional incidents. So reuse the enrichment information by storing it into log analytics. Modules is another really important thing. Don't try to build monolithic one big module, one big logic app which does it all, but split it up into different parts. Have one for IP enrichment, one for account enrichment, one for office activity, and make sure that you can connect all of those modules together into a playbook, so it can reuse all of those playbooks, and the new playbooks can be created pretty simple. Second to last, be lazy, be smart, be lazy. There's lots out there. We have the gallery, we have GitHub, we have personal GitHub repos from people from the community. There is so much out there already. And if you're just getting started, don't try to reinvent the wheel, but see what have others done. They're not always going to do it the right way, but it's a starting point for you to not lose too much time getting started. So having examples, having templates can get a really long way into get going. And the last point I wanted to make, enrichment before automation. Enrichment is a quick win in my opinion. You can get data and put it into the incident, and it doesn't take that much time. The real pain in security automation is deciding when can the incident be closed and adding those conditions to the playbooks. And you can spend a ton of time on that, getting those conditions just right. So I do recommend don't stare your way down that hole and closing the incidents automatically, but try it first with enrichment. That's the quickest win. You will lose a lot less time, and then you can keep moving forward. So with this, we came to the end. It was a ton of information. I'm exhausted by talking so fast, put all of the information out there in a adequate time. I hope this was interesting and provided some tips and tricks to both new people new to logic apps and new to automation, but also people with more experience. So if you have questions, now is the time to either unmute or put them into chat. And I would also greatly appreciate if you scan the QR code on the right. That's a session feedback, which will be used both by the organization and by myself to see how we can improve or what can be done the next time. So I want to have a big thank you to all for listening. And if you have any questions, I will monitor the chat for a bit to see.